Hi, everyone. Welcome to the First and Last Word Poetry series. Harris and I are glad to see you all here tonight and very excited about the readers tonight. Our first reader is David P. Miller, and his collection, Bend in the Stair, was published by Lily Poetry Review Books this year. His poems recently appeared in Meat for Tea, the Poetry Porch, Boston Literary Review, the American Journal of Poetry, Lily Poetry Review, and Nixes Mate Review. He is a retired college librarian, and I give you David.
Thank you, Gloria and Harris, and thanks for everyone being here. And of course, as has often been said, the great thing about going first is that I can relax and listen to Ruth and Gary afterwards without having to anticipate anything on my behalf. So I've got a few poems that I'd like to read from Bend in the Stair, which is the new book. A lot of it is about family and somewhat autobiographical, although not all the poems I'm going to read will be such, but start off with one of the autobiographical or family poems. The story so far. You made it past the kitchen cockroaches, some play-acted fumbles at adultery, past the DOA-MA that tripped you down the garden path to part-time jobs in slapdash fragments. You made it past the divorce, then 5 years in a gnat cloud of stillborn lusts. Past the landlord lineup, a cul-de-sac of bosses. You even made it past a professor. You survived your mother's vacant decay, sat with your father's final heartbeat, and you haven't died yet. In the sequel, you junk their address labels, abort his phone bill, waste paper their church programs, adopt his litter of bookmarks. The proof you're still alive is your first sighting of your mother's high school pictures with her love note in his sock drawer. In the book, there are a couple of somewhat hidden poems of seasonal cycles, and so I'll read the two that actually address autumn. First, This Nectar. My hand's shadow floats across the table, projected from a cloud cover tapestry, freehand in grays and whites, light extended from our nearest star. Our city window, almost fully green, with conflagrations at the edges. Flame flowers saturate the eye. Hold briefly still before the trees drop their bunting, turn again to rest. Chill spills from my fingertips. Here steeps tea from Sri Lanka. It is beautiful. Sri Lanka, breath at teeth, hushes, then melts amber across the tongue. My cold body makes this nectar happen. The interior kindles against the skin's anxiety, its fear to meet the air without protection, without a tender carapace of flannel, wool, or down. The introvert eye comes forward with attention still more full as the mercury contracts, turns shy. We're all late October. And then, my late father-in-law's new project, in memory of Joseph Norris Wiley, 1919 to 2012. In his hospice room, Joe took an exit alone. But our electrical engineer, relentless inventor, never lacks a fresh direction, even now in a place beyond language. He rewires the forest, though we can't unearth the apparatus. It's all his workshop, like the stream you hear. Wait, isn't that sound a bit too much elsewhere? The same impending babble, augmented to widen the radius of hikers' delight. We'll never guess his algorithm for autumn. Each leaf fully chromatic, not one dull, not remnant green aftertime, but his circuits can't be found. The data desirably obscure. These woods, still his workbenches, his inventor's broad basement. He experiments with new barks, shuffles fungal forms, scraps the dead ends, redrafts, and gets out of the way. Next one I'm going to read actually is sort of in honor of the space where, for of course, many years, First and Last Word was, which is the Arts at the Armory Cafe in Somerville. And although the poem doesn't say so, those of you who have been there, particularly if you were there on Saturday mornings or early afternoons, may recognize the following scene. Mr. and Mr. and Mr. Jazz. Mr. and Mr. and Mr. Jazz hammer it solid in the cafe. The fingers of one Mr. Jazz jump and warble. He skitters the tuned good enough low-rise piano flat to a whitewashed wall of this reprocessed old armory. Plastic-bound chord charts lean slant above the keys. Two Mr. Jazz battles the bongos, bap, bap, basement, hepcat style. He skids lyrics from a real gone century over a larynx vibratoed in a somehow tenor. Snow white skies scat in little pieces. Fleece-layered families drift down the hall to the winter farmer's market under the drill hall ceiling in fuchsia. Olive oil focaccia, pickled jalapenos, sour cherry mead, root vegetable spectrum replace shouldered arms and horse routines. Three Mr. Jazz makes an easy chair from a random wooden seat, contemplates the bridge of his guitar like an elder retreated from the ridiculous world to a monk's cave. Two Mr. Jazz bounces his palm off a knee for all us noshers, not snapping fingers, nodding, shouting, "Go, man!" Mr. and Mr. and Mr. Jazz harvests a boss green tip jar today. One Mr. Jazz's right hand does the funky roller coaster as table space waxes and wanes. Families frown over lacked lunch seats. Here in this corner, a face with frost mustache scribbles a lime cloth notebook, tops up with lentil soup. Do-dad-do-em, biddly-dad-do-da, bedo-biddy-dee-um. Two Mr. Jazz twitches hot foot across the comfort food changes. As I have mentioned, a lot of the book, and not that poem particularly, but have to do with family and particularly my parents and my late parents. But here's one about my mother. My mother loved The Sound of Music deeply, the film and the show. And when at one point my father took a vacation trip to the Austrian Alps, and she couldn't resist enacting the scene that's in this brief poem here. Meadowtop, 2006. Mother's arms flow a wide beeline, spread from her shoulders like hawk wings. Jacket of patchwork and bands, snow-toned cobalt blue. Loose sleeves gather mountain sky. Dad's lens mirrors her hues with the Austrian Alps. A screenplay in layers of mantles behind her. Glasses and smile, canted to sunlight, grass anchored, heart choired. After Julie Andrews wheeled on the wide screen with her arms splayed like that, singing "The Hills Are Alive," picture my mother safeguarded this truly happening instant. How could she not sing for it and spin? And something about my father. Poem in two parts. Sunrises with my father. 1. My father settled in a place where he could walk outdoors all year, made it his pleasure to help the old folks. Retired, but barely stepped across that definite senior discount line. He rose each Florida's pre-dawn, traced on foot the route the paper boys followed to fling the Sarasota Herald Tribune lightly at the ends of driveways. If these neighbors were the definite elders, my parents were numbered among the youngers. He knew the old ones by name, knew which of them needed their news carried to their porches. Warmth and moisture soothed his lungs, grown rasping with Massachusetts freeze. 20 minutes walk before the sun burst out, with its own baggage, helped to shrink a belly pointlessly enlarged. I wanted to know something beyond the tourist guides about this place, so easy, soft, and alien. Some mornings on our visits near the solstice, those shortened days, oddly considered cold, I'd rise and dress in darkness, shielding my wife's shut eyes against marauding light, fumble to the living room to meet him. Off we'd set, do-gooders at the end of night, returned for coffee as bands of red lifted above the roofs. 2. 20 years downstream, my father, a widower, one of the elders, still met the early hours before I cared to. I'd fumble out to meet him, his head crooked back on the rose-pink recliner, shut-eyed after first caffeine. The other olds now fended on their own, for headlines dropped at their driveway's ends. The younger elder, I stepped into light for one minuscule good deed, fetched the paper for his second waking, or his third. And I'll conclude with this briefer two-part poem. His Mouth. 1. Have you thought about dying? This is the pulmonologist's voice from a room at the other end of the ICU. I can see a pair of loved ones just inside that portal, looking toward their someone in the bed who may answer with a quiet word or look. We can't tell. My brothers and I are waiting for the pulmonologist. We stand outside my father's room for 45 minutes, saying nothing, facing his sedated silence. When a baby is born in this hospital, Brahms' lullaby in digital tinkling murmurs from the intercom. 2 newborns arrive somewhere as we watch my father's chest rise and sink. Jagged lines trace the screen behind him. 2. His mouth pried open with tubes for his lungs and gut. He nods his head at the pulmonologist's questions. Does he want the tubes out? Does he know what that means? We are dismissed for 20 minutes. We return to his bed behind drawn goldenrod curtains, his mouth empty of plastic, gaped and free, his body unwired. My brothers tell me they see movement beneath the light blanket at his chest. I don't. That's it. Thank you. Thank you. And thank you. Gloria mentioned that we who are reading could give you a little verbal info about where to get the book if you're interested. Well, you can simply look on Lily Poetry Review. That's the name of the publisher and the site. And Lily Poetry Review, and you'll find it. So thanks very much. Thanks, Gloria. Thanks, Harris. Thanks, everybody. Now I can listen to everybody else. Yay.
Thank you, David. That was wonderful. And thank you for mentioning where you can get your new book. Author of Salty Liquor, 2014, and Liner Notes, 2017, Gary Rainford lives year-round on Swans Island with his wife and daughter. Adrift, forthcoming by North Country Press, and Gary's third collection of poems tells the stories of Gary's mother's dementia and Alzheimer's disease. And you can check out his website at www.garyrainford.com. And I give you Gary.
Thank you. Since I'm way up north, 6 miles off the coast, and you folks, I think most of you are likely in the Somerville, Boston, greater Boston area. My weather is a little bit different perhaps, and last night the wind was just speaking to me like it often does this time of year. And this morning when I woke up to walk the dog, I wasn't quite sure if the ferry was running. so I thought it'd be appropriate to start with anemometer. The winds howl, savage, picks up force and speed as it cuts across Blue Hill Bay, whipsaws Atlantic Road, rams my house, rattles it, the walls, the windows, the block foundation, nearly 2 centuries old, then keeps moving. No conscience, no guilt, no more pity than a sunrise. I lived out on Swans Island since 2001, and it's getting to be that time, and I'm gonna say the bad word, but winter is coming, and I love winter. I love how it slows, how I slow down during the winter. So I'm gonna read Wintering. This is my first collection of book, Salty Liquor. It's early. A gaunt morning moon is a frozen hole in the gray, still sky. The Captain Henry Lee, our ferry, won't be crossing today. The island, cut off, locked down, is without electricity or telephone. Giant and collapsed ice heaves like megaliths clutter Mackerel Cove. The roads are frozen. Snowdrifts are frozen. Deep artesian well casings are frozen. Domestic hot water pipes are frozen. Septic lines frozen. Gas lines frozen solid too. And my pickup truck wouldn't start last Friday. Buddy at the dump described the oil in his Cherokee as slushy. January doesn't thaw until the very first purple crocus bulb blooms in May. I'm going to read a couple of pieces from my second book, Liner Notes. Liner Notes is a little unique, or unique for me at least. It's a collection of 64 ekphrastic poems. Generally, you might expect an ekphrastic poem to describe a painting. However, Liner Notes describes 64 musicians as artists making art, making music. So with that, I know we're all muted, but perhaps Ruth, you can help me out. I'm going to ask you to make a decision. Would you like to hear a poem about Patti Smith or Billie Holiday? Is there any way for Ruth to chime in on that?
I'm Ruth.
Oh,
I'm incognito tonight because we switched computers. So
Patti Smith or Billie Holiday?
I'll take Billie Holiday.
Okay. Don't explain. Written as a protest poem, Billie Holiday prays with eyes closed for the lynching to end as piano keys remember the impossible. A father who abandoned her as an infant, and the 1930s incident in Marion, Indiana. A mob of white men break into the city jail using sledgehammers. They beat and hang 2 black suspects from nearby poplar trees. Here is a fruit for the crows to pluck, for the rain to gather, for the wind to suck, for the sun to rot, for the tree to drop. Here is a strange and bitter crop. Young Billie Holiday's slow, bluesy jazz crushes the ginned, cigarette-choked room at Cafe Society, Greenwich Village chic, where waiters stop all service for the scent of magnolias. I'd like to read one more from Liner Notes, and it's sort of a segue into my new manuscript, which are poems about my mom, and I'll explain a little bit about that. I like to read this piece because I my whole life I've managed depression, and I became my mom's guardian in 2017, and that was a real trigger. And I took care of my mom for nearly 4 years. However, this piece that I wrote uh, describing Leonard Cohen gives me a lot of hope. Closing time. Mandolin, violin, fedora, tailored black suit Renaissance man, and three red robins singing into one mic. Leonard Cohen is on his knees at Mount St. Baldy Zen Center after 5 years in seclusion. Jakan, which means silence, is his Dharma name. Love is to overlook and forgive. Cohen's voice relaxes, finds an easy way to discuss self-reform. It's not a cry that you hear at night. It's not somebody who's seen the light. It's a cold and it's a broken hallelujah. He sings in Halifax, all his money gone. Retirement accounts and charitable trust funds embezzled by a close friend. Getting older, he says, in defiance of body decay, a lifelong depression has lifted. My new manuscript, Adrift, will be published April of 2022. I recently received an email giving me that timeline from North Country Press, so I'm quite excited knowing that the end's in sight, so to speak. Adrift tells the stories of my mom's dementia and Alzheimer's. Like I said, I became her guardian and caretaker in 2017. In the beginning, when she was in and out of clarity, where she was still herself most of the time, still quite independent. And the book tells her story from that moment in Florida until her gasping last breath in Bangor in hospice. And I refer to my mom as Bobby in this book. When I was cleaning out her house in Florida, I came across her high school yearbooks, and I was a bit stunned to learn that all her friends who wrote to my mom, have a good life, good luck doing whatever it is you're going to pursue, they referred to her as Bobby. And my mother's name is Barbara. I'd never known this person as Bobby, so it seemed like a perfect fit for the protagonist in Adrift. This first piece is called Wonder Woman. Sheila from Beacon Hospice sticks her head around the corner. Come in. Bobby's voice is small. I'm still here. You're an amazing woman. Sheila squeezes Bobby's feet over the covers, then both legs, then a twig of a shoulder poking out from under the blanket. And then Sheila's lips land on Bobby's forehead. If I cracked my head like you, honey, Sheila pulls a blouse off a hanger from the closet, I'd be in traction. Sheila glances at Debbie, Bobby's caseworker, and raises her eyebrow at the miracle of walking away from St. Joe's emergency room after falling down a flight of stairs. How do you feel? Not all that amazing. Bobby turns, looks at me reclined on the motorized lift chair by the bed. Maybe that's the key in life, not knowing how amazing we are. I joke, but I'm deadly serious. This next piece is called Doppelganger. Kina skates to our table, digital camera dangling on a lanyard from her wrist. Want me to take your picture? Bobby says no, but I reply, Absolutely. And drag my chair closer, pressing my face to Bobby's, wrapping an arm around her neck. Say, memory care. I joke before Kina asks us to say cheese, and Bobby's already reaching to see herself in the demented world of Alzheimer's disease. Darling, you look marvelous. I wisecrack in my best Billy Crystal Fernando accent. And Bobby replies, pointing at the man sitting beside her in the pick, face pressed to hers, arm draped around her neck. That's your son, isn't it? So when I brought my mom from Florida to Maine, she had a little dog, Max, a little poodle. And one of the reasons I had her at a assisted living place in Bangor is they let me keep Max with my mom, which was really important to her and really important to me. However, it got to a point where Max, she couldn't take care of Max, and he was becoming aggressive towards other patients or guests or residents at Winterberry Heights. So my mom at this point was not quite clear for the most part, and we swapped out real Max for a mechanical dog Max, who she actually believed was real Max. So the dog that I'm referring to in this poem is not a real dog, but a fake dog, a stuffed animal that mom believed was real. Mostly believe that he was real. It's called tracheotomy. Snoozing, nuzzling Max. Bobby's eyes flutter and struggle behind baggy lids, as if she's dreaming an action movie. She sleeps a lot, says Kayla, a tattooed med tech who taps Bobby on the arm. Time for meds, hon. She chirps and Bobby opens her mouth like a chickadee so Kayla can spoon the crushed pills mixed with strawberry pudding. Bobby swallows, makes a yuck face, then looks at me. Good, she says. You're here. We really need to talk. I want help with my dog. He's not eating again. She sticks a fingernail in his mouth and dried who knows what catapults. I want you to cut him here so I can get food in his belly. She spreads fur, crusty fur on his neck. I offer to take Max to my vet, but she says there's a knife in her back I can use. And I will end with this last piece. Although I jumped around for tonight's reading, the Adrift reads chronologically from, so that originally I thought perhaps having the poems disordered, sort of like the way my mom was thinking, would work, but I didn't think that that would communicate well with readers, so it reads sequentially. This is called All We Want Is Love. You bring me light, says Bobby, as I guide a forkful of shredded egg sandwich to her lips. There's a familiar focus in her eyes and a clarity to her words, but neither lasts more than a wink. I do not want to watch my mother dying today, but we do not get to cherry pick when life needs or does not need us most. Thank you very much.
So let's have another round of applause for Gary Rainford. Thank you, Gary. If you can't hear me, raise your hand. Otherwise, I'll assume everybody can hear. So our next featured reader is Ruth Smullin, who's from the greater Boston area. Her poetry has appeared in Atlanta Review, Common Ground Review, Constellations, Crucible, where she won the Sam Ragan Prize, Ibbetson Street, Main Street Rag, Naugatuck River Review, Plainsongs, South Air Poetry Review, and the Aurorean. Her chapbook, The Open Door, published by Finishing Line Press, was published in 2020. Please, let's have a nice warm round of applause for Ruth Smullin.
And I first wanted to thank David and Gary for your fine poetry. It was really a pleasure to hear you read. And I also want to thank Gloria and Harris for having this first and last word poetry series for so many years and for the opportunity to read today. I didn't have the presence of mind to have a copy of my chapbook in hand, but I will put the information in the chat after I read about where to get it. I'm going to read some newer poems. Oh, thank you, Peter. I'll read some newer poems along with some poems from my chapbook, The Open Door. And I'm going to start with a prose poem that's part of a very short series of poems based on primary colors. This one is Blue. Cornflower, blue jay, forget-me-not, knees black and blue when we were kids playing marbles on the sidewalk. Summers at the beach, nothing but blue skies. We picked blueberries, tried catching bluefish from the dock. Soon we were drunk on Elvis's blue suede shoes, wore lipstick and nylons to dances where no one asked us to dance, talked a blue streak, pretending we didn't care. Blue stockings in college, we took lovers, wore blue jeans, learned to smoke, listened to the blues. We were cool, didn't care how the blues began, too many sad stories, weren't interested in our parents' blue-collar roots, their hard work. No blue bloods in our family, only immigrants, survivors. Tattoo on a wrist, numbers in blue. Raspberry patch in winter. Rising from deep snow, the canes stand spare, naked, bright calligraphy in late sun. Their long shadows, delicate, insubstantial, reach out across the white expanse. Wind howls, trash can lids fly, skitter, bang against the fence. The canes press against each other, whisper their song. In 1952, my mother's cousin, who had survived the war, arrived from Europe to become part of our extended family. Miriam's blue suit. Preparing to leave Paris after the war, mother, father, brother gone, to live with cousins in America. She went to a well-known couturier, her boss's friend, who gave her a price she could afford. She ordered a suit in a classic style, French blue wool, velvet trim on the collar of the jacket, a garment to last a lifetime, armor in an unfamiliar world. She knew the importance of appearances, fashionable clothing, a good haircut, makeup. In the camps, rouge she found hidden on a corpse gave color to her ashen face, made her look healthy enough to work, helped save her from the ovens. Becoming Scheherazade. What's new, my aged cousin asks, her opening gambit in our daily phone calls. Not much, I say. Most days like the one before, the question a challenge. When she mentions new cases of COVID in her building, I talk about My Octopus Teacher, a documentary I enjoyed, amazed that a mollusk can be responsive to a human. She's read about octopuses, how intelligent they are. She misses going to the movies. Her Toronto friend's new book has arrived at last. If only she had the energy to read it. I tell her about a drawing my grandson made of himself on his scooter. She laughs. I've hit the jackpot. We pause. So what else is new? She asks. The next three poems refer to the work of my late husband, Smullin, a sculptor. Legacy. With a fine metal stylus, he drew a landscape, incising the lines into a flat palette of clay, a mold for plaster that, when poured, hardened, removed, became the final work, everything in relief. Blades of grass alive, leaves trembling on a tree, ridged bark of the trunk, absence cast into presence as memory transforms our dead. The first line of this next poem arrived in a phone call from my daughter. Wax. Mother, I'm throwing you out. The sculpture of your head, that is, that Dad made before I was born. Your nose is squashed. It's only wax, never meant to be permanent. The nose a handle when Grandma moved it from piano to shelf to table and back. It's the piece I took when Grandma left for the nursing home. No one else wanted it. I liked the dark brown wax, sticky to the touch, patina of dust, a whole sheet of it wrapped around the base of your neck to make your shoulders. It moved with me to New Jersey, California, Canada, where I left it with my abandoned boyfriend till I found a place of my own. By then, your nose was horribly misshapen, flattened against your cheeks as if a boxer had landed a punch, overshadowing the rest of the face, still quite lovely, eyes closed, lips parted, faint marks of Dad's fingers on your forehead, where he smoothed the wax, made you a crown of hair. Bronze relief, self-portrait of the artist in his studio. Dear husband, whose face I still know well, bushy eyebrows, high cheekbones, strong curve of the nose, that mole above your droopy mustache, only a glimpse of your studio behind you, drill on the table. Here, you're the story, fully alive as if emerging in the flesh from that cold metal, collar wrinkled, charcoal stick in your pocket, your left hand, the hand you drew with, resting on your shirt. Head erect, lips firmly pressed, you're looking at me, your gaze serious, attentive, inviting me to look back at you. Like many people, I get very attached to some of my plants. This poem is called A Purple Like No Other. Replacement for my mother's cherished lilac, murdered by my father's zealous pruning, her then new lilac is penance and success, limbs like the arms of a supplicant reaching toward the sun, year after year covered with huge clusters, deep reddish purple, intense perfume filling the air. For 2 years, the aged trunks, weighed down by winter's wet snows, lay on the ground as rabbits ate the tender ends of branches. By spring, 2 trunks were dead, the rest barely blooming. To replace it, unthinkable, my mother's favorite, now mine. Surgery was prescribed, dead trunks removed, others cut back severely. By summer, an abundance of leafy shoots had risen from every stump-like limb, the near dead miraculously birthing the new. A Girl with a Watering Can, Renoir, 1876. In her rather formal blue dress with lace trim and matching blue boots, she appears to be 3 or 4, standing in a bright garden, a small watering can in one hand, a few daisies in the other. She looks off to the side with a smile, red bow in her blonde hair. Long ago, I spent a week in Washington, D.C., visiting my Aunt Edith. At the National Gallery of Art, we looked at paintings a girl of 11 might enjoy. Renoir, Degas, Vermeer, Cassatt. When we'd looked our fill, Edith bought me some prints as a gift. I chose A Girl with a Watering Can, Vermeer's Girl with the Red Hat, her face turned expectantly toward me, lips parted as if to speak, and Raphael's portrait, Bindo Altaviti, a handsome young man with a grave demeanor, hair falling softly on his shoulders. I still have Girl with the Red Hat and Bindo Altaviti. The Renoir would have seemed childish by the time I was 12, an aspiring teen with a daring, older best friend. I'll close with one of my favorites from the chapbook. Pomegranate on a white plate, my own still life. Fruit lavish as a rose colors the room, pleases my eye. For weeks, I study its odd shape, angles like cheekbones, skin taut with the fullness of what's hidden, the blossom end, a tiny crown. Voluptuous as an odalisque, this pomegranate, my work of art, my eye, the medium. As rosy skin begins to fade and shrivel, I struggle to fix forever the exact shade, the particular form. With my knife, I lay bare the rows of tiny fruit, bright as rubies, bite into crisp flesh, sweet, acid. Thank you. I guess I would say that people can email me at rasmullin@verizon.net. That's rasmullin@verizon.net. Thank you.
So let's have another round of applause for our 3 featured poets, David P. Miller, Gary Rainford, and Ruth Smullin. Anyway, following our featured readers, we always have a Q&A session. So does anybody have a question for any of the features or all of them? Anybody? Then I'll start it. This is a question for all three of you. What was the pivotal moment in your life where you felt that poetry was your calling? What was the influence, and how did you respond initially, and then how did you carry it over?
Why don't we start with you, David?
Good, thanks, RJ. That way I don't have to decide. I don't really have, I actually have a very sort of ordinary story, and I won't take up much time with it. I've been reading poetry for decades, daily, but only in my mid-50s, when I took a couple of just one-off workshops with poets, including Jane Hirschfield, but just really like one day, one weekend. And, something came out of that. And really I thought, maybe I could do this. And, not to do the whole blow by blow, but it really started from a very simple seed after having been, as I say, a reader of poetry for ages. So it wasn't like a road to Damascus moment, right? Where I just sort of fell off my horse and said, my God, this is it. It wasn't like that at all. That's what I'll say.
Thank you. Gary, why don't you go next?
Sure, thanks. I suppose it was pivotal, but I wasn't quite aware of its impact at this time. However, in the summer of 6th grade, I had asthma as a boy, and the summer of 6th grade, it was so bad that I was hospitalized. And as a kid, I used to draw cartoons, and I loved to draw cartoons. If you saw me at my house or at somebody's house, I always had a pad and I had my pencils. However, in the hospital, hooked up to a machine to help me breathe, and laying down the way I was, I wasn't in a position to draw. And I found myself using words in my head to draw pictures to occupy the time in the hospital. And when I got out of the hospital, I started putting those down on paper, and I stopped drawing and I started writing. I didn't know I was writing poetry. I was just putting words on paper and drawing pictures with words instead of lines. I don't think it was until college, as an undergraduate, that I realized I was writing poetry. I identified more with musicians. One of the reasons why I think my second book is called Liner Notes is because I loved getting the record album in that would come out and crack it open and read the lyrics and study the lyrics and hear the lyrics. So I think I was really writing music at that time. But then when I realized that there are poets who were doing what I was doing, I started moving in that direction and became a poet, I think, in my probably 19 or 20 years old, when the librarian at the music library took me to read out in the Hamptons and said, "You're a poet, you need to start calling yourself a poet."
And let's have Ruth finish up on that question. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. As a child, I loved reading fairy tales, and I always dreamed of writing my own stories. However, that never was part of my education. Unfortunately, I went through a public school system that did not allow opportunities for writing, and I didn't really. I also was not able to get into the highly competitive writing courses at the college level. So all of this just got deferred. I would say that I always had an active imagination and a vivid fantasy life. I still do. But none of that sort of came into play until I was in my 40s, and my professional life revolved around working with children And I was very, very immersed in children's literature, and I started writing for children. And then, because I was a parent, I started writing nonfiction for a parenting publication where I lived. And then I started writing poetry, and I was doing all these different things. And I finally decided that I really was more interested in poetry than these other forms of writing. So at that point, I started going to workshops and trying to focus my effort in a different way. So that's it.
Wonderful responses to Harris's question. David, you want to follow up with Gary, I believe? Go ahead.
No, I'm sorry. I was being confusing. I was just giving thumbs up and stuff like that.
Oh,
Make a comment real quick to David. It probably wasn't much for you to switch over to poetry because, of course, doing theater together, I remember your script writing, your performance art pieces, and that which were so strong and written so wonderfully. And so it's no surprise that when you started to write poetry that it continued, and that's all I wanted to say.
Oh, thanks. Yeah, I mean, and it's not to be coy about it. I mean, I had done other types of writing for live performance. Yeah, I mean, I had done that. In fact, I've done a fair amount of that in my life. But just to make this quick, I wasn't doing writing that I intended to live on the page as well as in live performance. And for me, that was a crucial threshold. And there's, I'll just leave it at that. But yeah, it's true.
I have one final question for all three of you, and that would be, I'll call it poetry of place. Where are you most impacted or affected for your writing? I mean, what environment? I suspect that Gary's would be, of course, among the elements in the middle of the ocean and everything. But with Gary, it would be what season, maybe. And with everybody else, it would be what environment impacts your writing the most.
all right. If we want to go in the same rotation, go ahead, David.
Okay. That's interesting because so many of my poems have to do with family, not all of them by any means, that they're more located in memory or in the places where those events happened. I am influenced to a certain extent by being here in Jamaica Plain, in my house, in other people's, in my late in-laws' house, when we had that house. But I think it's a very interesting question, but honestly, I think it's quite variable. And then there's this whole, I'll just say briefly, there's this whole genre of stuff that I write, none of which I read this evening, and it's not in the book either, that one might call experimental poetry, which isn't place-based at all. That's the best I can do, but thank you.
Thank you, David. Gary, you want to go ahead and respond?
Thanks. Yes, thank you. It's kind of funny. I do live in a stereotypical, ideal poetry environment. I at least this idealized environment for a poet or for a creative person. We're 6 miles off the coast. It's a 40-minute ferry ride. When the ferry's not running, we're cut off from the mainland, and so it's a very quiet place. It's a beautiful place. It's a rugged place. However, I think for me, what's most important is not so much the poetry of place, although the poetry of place does come out as a theme in much of my work. I think it's more routine. Poetry has been a part of my life for most of my life, and it wasn't until I made it a routine, a regular routine, that it really took hold, and I started writing poetry that other people were interested in. And for me, my routine is I get up at 3:30 or 3:45, and I write for a few hours. And I like that quiet, peaceful time in my world where nothing else exists other than, at least right now, this time of year, I get up, I start the wood stove, I get some coffee going, and that's it. Nothing else in Gary's life exists. My wife's asleep, my daughter's asleep, my bills are paid, and I don't worry about a thing other than the current project that I'm working on at that moment. But I will say the other important factor is I see myself as a storyteller who uses poetry to tell stories. I think my strongest work is when I'm telling somebody else's story, and when I removed myself from the poem. My first book, Liner Notes, I play, although I make cameos, I'm a peripheral figure. They're poetry, they're poems about other people. Liner Notes, they're all poems about other people. And then Adrift, they're my mom's stories. And again, I play a peripheral role. I'm not the main character. And I think telling those stories and treating the act as though it were a job, perhaps, one set time for a set amount of time. And at the end of the week, there's X amount of hours, X amount of words, X amount of production, and ultimately get it down on the paper.
It's wonderful time management, Gary. Ruth, you want to close up and we'll finish out tonight's show after your answer.
Yeah, I think I would say something similar to what David said, which is the place is in memory. And, when I first started writing poetry, I did not set out to write things about my family or my growing up or any of that. And I was kind of all over the map. And somehow at some point, the past and my family became more and more central to my poems. And I realized that those poems had much more substance than the other things that I was trying to write about, which were relatively impersonal and therefore not as interesting. And it's what has been interesting to me in writing is just that even when I think I'm starting out writing about something that's not connected to family, it often it just turns up that somehow my family or the past parts of my life become part of that poem, even when I don't necessarily expect that to happen.
Thank you, Ruth.
Thank you, everyone, for coming tonight. And let's give another round of applause for the readers. And thank you so much. And next month, our reading will be held on December 14th, a week earlier. So thank you, everybody, and bye-bye.
Thanks a lot. Thank you.
Thanks,
everybody. Good night.
Good night.